Hello and welcome. I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we are making a 1913 evening gown that is secret pants. Throughout Western history, women's standard garments have always been skirts and dresses. But though pants as women's garments in the West were considered a very highly irregular thing for women to do in the past, it wasn't actually as big of a faux pas as you might assume by more modern ideas. But that, of course, only applies to upper class women. There are several examples throughout the 17th and 18th century of women wearing pants. But usually, the only socially accepted places for women to wear pants was while horseback riding, and oftentimes they would be covered and concealed by skirts. But during the 19th century and the rise of the women's rights movement that would become later the suffragettes, there was also a push towards more practical fashions, and a part of this was the bloomer fashion. And though there was a brief craze for arranging bloomer balls, it was not considered something that would be okay for formal occasions, and there was backlash from men. Then again, there was backlash from men for most of the things women wore, but that's a different story. But riding breeches had become an accepted attire while horseback riding in the 18th century, in the 19th century with the invention of the bicycle, and especially when it becomes the two-wheeled thing that we are familiar with as the bicycle, it became popular for also women to ride a bicycle. And then these bloomers that were first a part of the rational dress movement became a part of the bicycle active sportswear attire. But even though women were mocked for wearing these, and not all women would dare to wear the actual bloomers for bike riding, but would instead wear the more skirt-looking split skirts, or would wear bloomers with a skirt that has a device that would lift up the skirts while you're riding the bike to make it more safe. Women's pants in general were still considered very much sports attire, and not something that would be appropriate outside of that setting. But that really changed in the 1910s, especially the early part of it, when women's skirts, for the first time in a very long time, started rising up to the level that they could reveal, even just regular day dresses could reveal a little bit of ankle. And like evening gowns always tend to take things to the extremes, a lot of evening gowns had slits that could reveal much more of the ankle and even calf. At the same time, skirts also become very narrow and often draped in interesting ways to create that room that is necessary for walking in such a narrow skirt. These skirts were called the hobble skirt, and if you look at the shape of these types of garments, you can actually see a very strong resemblance to Turkish pants and Turkish wear. These started appearing in 1913 and 1914 especially. And most of them could be seen at the races or in lounging gowns, but there were also evening gowns with the same style. Galoseur especially did these lounging pants and these evening gowns with very loose, very drapey pants that basically didn't have like the traditional pants shape to them, but they were connected in the middle and had leg holes. Though these were a very fashionable garment, there was a lot of pushback against them, and this would be a garment only worn by the very ultra-fashionable elite. This would not be something that the morality of a middle-class lady would have accepted. In this time period, upper classes were considered kind of above the law in many ways, and above like moral restrictions in certain areas that were given to other women. The middle class was the highly conservative class that really upheld themselves as and considered themselves more moral than the morally corrupt lower classes where women worked and did all sorts of scandalous things, and then the upper classes that were considered morally bankrupt because of the wealth and the money. I find it fascinating that in this era, specifically these 1913 and 1914 years, a lot of things that we consider ultra-modern were actually in fashion. Not only were these pantsuits, even for evening gowns, which we don't really see again until the late 1930s, and even then they were considered very scandalous. But also the short hairstyles that we associate very much with flappers and 1920s actually became fashionable for the first time in this era. This evening gown is strongly influenced by Gallo's fashions, and specifically this evening gown, but it is not direct replica because I have never studied one, so all I had to go through was the pictures, and that only shows how the garment looks. I do not know all the construction details, but I made mine using my knowledge of the construction methods of the time and made my best educated guess based on that.
Since the bodice portion of this gown is a rather typical 1910s evening gown bodice, I used the Patterns of Fashion 2 1910 evening gown as the basis for my bodice. I drafted it based on the original, but changing a few things to make it fit my measurements better. Then I cut the pieces out of my silk taffeta lining. After the bodice pieces are sewn together, boning is inserted at the seams and the seam allowances are whipped. I lay the bodice on my fashion fabric and cut it around the bodice slightly bigger than the lining. And this is where I had a major brain fart and for some reason sewed the top edge of the fabrics together instead of folding the fashion fabric over the lining like it's usually done. For the back closure, I used hook and eye tape that I sandwiched between the fashion fabric and the lining. And here I'm doing with the bottom edge what I should have done with the top edge as well. So I'm folding the fashion fabric over the lining and pinning it to place, and then stitching it on by hand. And here's the finished bodice with tubes of the fashion fabric as straps. And now to figure out the pants, since they are just a length of fabric that goes between my legs, I tie a ribbon around my waist and use another ribbon, how long I'll need to cut the fabric. It's supposed to hit just above my ankle in the middle. This way I can check how the length looks when I move around and don't have to worry about actual numbers. Then I place that ribbon onto my fabric and measure out the correct length, adding a seam allowance at both ends. I fold my fabric in half lengthwise and sew the side seams together, leaving an opening at the top for the closure and at the bottom for my legs to go through. Then I roll hem both edges of the fabric. I add hooks and eyes to the ribbon that is going to be the waistband. Then I sew 2 rows of gathering stitches, a little waist down from the rolled edge of the fabric. This will create a paper bag waist effect on the pants. Then I gather the fabric to match the length of the waistband and stitch it on. Now let's get dressed in it. Corsets of this era are very low on the hips. The idea is to smooth and streamline your own curves rather than create artificial curves that aren't there. To keep the waistline trim, my corset has hooks on either side of the center back, below the narrowest part of my waist, to keep the knot from creating unnecessary bulk at the waist. And for evening wear, you'd always wear silk stockings. They could be skin colored like mine with the seams in the back, or they could have all kinds of laces and fancy cutouts or even embroidery on them. And they could match the gown or be contrasting to it. While I think a big reason why the original bloomer design was considered so scandalous was because of it being so reminiscent of underwear, I think that this style was considered scandalous because of the lack of underwear. This style doesn't really need any kind of petticoats, even a split petticoat that would basically be like another pair of underpants. Simply because of the way the fabric drapes, it really doesn't get caught to your legs the same way as a traditional skirt does. Next comes the sash belt. This is just double the width of the fabric with tassels at the end. Instead of making the lace jacket that was worn with the style, I just used a thrifted late 1980s or early 1990s mother of the bride jacket. I just ripped the sleeves off and that's it. Well, the rest of this jewelry are antique originals. This is a replica piece from a ring found on the Titanic wreck. And here's the finished look. This is absolutely one of my favorite pieces to wear. It's so easy to wear and yet looks very elegant and put together. The only things I'd change about this is I'd do the neckline the historical way because it kind of pokes out now. I mean, it's an easy enough fix, but I just haven't bothered yet. And the other thing is I would put bigger tassels at the leg openings because these ones kind of get hidden by the drapery. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video and maybe learned something new about women's fashion and pants. And remember to like this video because it really does help out with the algorithm, and subscribe and hit that bell button if you haven't already so that I can see you again next time. Bye!
And though there was a brief craze, and though there was a brief and though there was a beef, this keeps on getting worse.